What a year 2024 has been. 73 elections across the world, including polls in the UK, France and the US, the first Labour government in 14 years, the return of Donald Trump and the rise of populism, alongside violent conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine and the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. We'll be discussing the highlights and the lowlights 2024 in this week's Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just it's all bigoted women.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Well, I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the final Downtown Den Politics podcast of 2024. And I'm joined as ever by the wonderful Joe Phillips and our resident historian, Jim Hancock, looking at the past 12 months, a review of what has been an absolutely momentous year politically. And I'm going to start at home with that election that took place on the 4th of July. It seems a long time ago now, guys, because Labour were elected for the first time in 14 years on a wave of enthusiasm, an awful lot of hope and optimism around in terms of how Keir Starmer and his team were going to perform. It's not been the easiest of 6 months, but just cast your minds back, if you will, to the start of the year, because, of course, back then, and I've listened back to our podcasts, we were all minded to say election in November. So let me take you back to the decision that Rishi Sunak made in the rain. He came out and announced that early surprise election. Jim, at that time, again, listening back to our clips, we thought, yes, a Labour win, but a very close affair. So Sunak ballsed it up on more than one count, because obviously the election coming early probably cost him more seats than it would have done otherwise. But it probably also caught the Labour Party on the hop, not necessarily in terms of the campaign, but certainly when it came to them taking over the reins of government. So two questions for you. Firstly, was Sunak wrong to call that early election from his own perspective, from his party's perspective? Secondly, did that initially benefit Labour, but ultimately cost them in terms of how they've been able to manage their first 6 months in office?
I think Starmer was wrong to call it when he did.
Sunak,
I mean, on the
good
basis
start
that
to the podcast, Jim. That's another one for the bloopers, Chris.
That we were working on the presumption that, when things are pretty hopeless, you operate on the basis that you hope that something's going to turn up, and you go as long as you can. I meon, probably not to January. I mean, that's a salutary thought, that it could actually, we could actually be in an election campaign now. Do you remember there was these sort of fantasies that it would be called in January 25, and we'd be polling over, people would be dropping leaflets with the Christmas cards. So, certainly a November election was what we all predicted and what any sane political strategist would suggest, because you go as long as you can. And by, and by then, because the Rwanda scheme, which the new Conservative leading figures are still promoting as having been a good idea, would have started. And if they'd shown any benefit from that, that would have been a plus. Maybe mortgage rates would have come down, and the Conservative Party itself would have been better prepared, because there was about 100 candidates unselected. So Sunak caught his own party off guard, and there was quite a lot of bad blood about that. And the campaign between central office and the number 10 was not well run. So it was a bad decision, and they would have got a slightly better result if they'd gone in the autumn. And
sorry, Jim, let me just interrupt for a second before we move on to Starmer. Let me ask Joe about the Sunak decision, because actually, subsequently, a number of his advisors have come out and said actually they could have gone earlier because such was the chaos behind the scenes, both in terms of the cabinet, but mostly in terms of the wider Conservative Parliamentary Party. He was under so much pressure, and they did fear genuinely a leadership challenge. So, although we would sit here today and say, well, of course, they suffered that landslide defeat, what he would push back and argue is we'd have looked even worse if I'd have waited until November, because although he could have saw off that leadership challenge, the fact that the Tories would have proved themselves once again to be in total turmoil would have made that result even worse.
Yeah, I agree with that. And actually, I think a year ago, I was not necessarily predicting, but I wouldn't have been surprised if they had gone in the spring of this year, just gone. And I think, you know, there are two plates to this, aren't there, really? There's the outside of Westminster, and there was what was going on at Westminster. And it was quite clear that Rishi Sunak had not got the support of the Tory party. They were coming apart at the seams. You know, he'd sacked Suella Braverman. There were people going rogue, briefing against, you know, we've heard all this before from every Tory leader since. And I think he'd got to the point where he thought nothing's going to get better. I might as well go out there. And I know what I'll do. I'll go out without an umbrella, without a raincoat, and look like a complete dick. And then I won't have to deal with this anymore. I think he'd just had enough. And I don't think things would have improved. But I would just take issue with you, Frank, on the Starmer thing. They have been in opposition for 14 years. Starmer has been leader for 4 or 5 years. They've had plenty of time. A few months difference shouldn't have made any difference to how they were prepared for government. And I know we'll talk about this a bit more, but, you know, he came in with quite a lot of people like Yvette Cooper and David Lammy, who'd been around for a while, Rachel Reeves. He'd got Sue Gray in place, who was supposed to smooth the transition period. And they've spectacularly failed.
I think that was the problem, though, wasn't it? That although you're absolutely right in saying they've been in opposition for 14 years and they should have been planning for government, my sense was they were still in campaign mode. And when they took the reins of office, they perhaps thought two things. Firstly, they had a bit more time to settle in, because August is usually a sleepy time in the world of politics. Of course, when you've got a new government elected with a landslide victory, then you're not really going to have the press saying, well, we'll give you a month to sort yourselves out. And then, of course, there were the riots as well. I think ultimately what did cost them in those early months, and continues to plague them in a sense, was that appointment of Sue Gray. Because even at the time, if you remember, we did say, yeah, smart move at one level, because it gave Labour an insight as to how Whitehall operates. But there was no political instinct in Sue Gray. She's a civil servant. And what this government has proved it desperately needs and desperately lacks at the moment is that political instinct, Jim.
Yes, I think just one quick historical reflection, because you'd be disappointed if I didn't do it. When I was covering the 1951 general election, when Clement Attlee went to the country only a year after he'd won a slim majority, there was a sort of feeling that they were all tired, having been in the government since the war, and they gave up. And that's a sort of parallel. So I think Joe's got a point there, that you do conclude that Sunak just wasn't prepared to carry on. He wanted to lance the boil for better or worse, and it was certainly worse. I think in terms of Labour's preparation, I think they were, in a sense, prepared. You know, they'd had, as Joe said, they had years, 14 years to prepare for government in a way. I think the tension was between the campaigners led by Morgan McSweeney and the government people led by Sue Gray. And when they clashed, when they came into office, there was the sort of frustration amongst the campaigners and ignorance about how government works, and they got frustrated and took it out on Sue Gray. So I think it was the battle between McSweeney and Gray that really did for them, rather than Sunak being clever and catching Starmer out?
I think that to put it in the context of McSweeney versus Gray is probably too simplistic a proposition, Jim. I think that if you've got a technocratic prime minister with a civil servant as your chief of staff, then you're going to struggle with the politics. It wouldn't have mattered whether it was Morgan McSweeney sat next door or whoever, ultimately that was always going to cost the government political capital because neither of them have what I would describe as that sort of good political instinct that Blair had in spades, for example. Boris Johnson's probably got that. Not a great manager of government, but he's got that political instinct. Farage has got that. So I think that the appointment, as I say, initially probably seemed reasonably smart because Labour had been out of office for so long. Let's get somebody in who understands the mechanics of Whitehall. But ironically, the perfect job for Sue Gray would have been the one that became available not long after Labour came into office, which was, of course, head of the civil service. Yeah. So it's a pity, really, that she didn't hang fire, or Starmer didn't hang fire and put into the job that suited her best. But let's just move on quickly from Labour to the other parties, because, of course, we will come back in the new year to what Labour does to get out of the melee it's got itself into during those first 6 months of office. Now, in one sense, you look at the numbers and you can say, well, the big winner was the Liberal Democrats, 70-odd seats, recovery that it's not been able to manage to receive since the coalition years. But I would argue that actually the big winners were reform. Joe, what do you think?
Well, I think the Liberal Democrats did really well. And I think, although people were slightly aghast at Ed Davies' stunts, from falling off paddle boards in Lake Windermere to, bungee jumping and everything else, he got the coverage, and they stuck to two issues. They stuck to social care and sewage pollution in our rivers and seas. So they got coverage, they've worked really hard at local level, and they've got people there. And I think it's quite interesting that while everybody is looking and talking about reform, the Liberal Democrats are quietly getting on with what they do best, which is working in their constituencies, building up membership, looking ahead to the local elections in May. And they've got some good, interesting new people. I think reform were the winners. I think, surprising in a way that they got 5 seats, but of course being an MP at long last has given Nigel Farage another platform from which to address a grateful nation. But I think it was also a really good result for the Greens. For years and years and years there was that wonderful stalwart Caroline Lucas on her own. They've now got 5 MPs, and I think what this election showed is that people are much more savvy about tactical voting. I think Labour and the Lib Dems had a tacit agreement that they wouldn't campaign against each other. But I think, as we go into the next electoral cycle, which is the local elections and then Scotland and Wales, I think, reform is going to be the issue. And I think, all of us, whatever party we are aligned to, and all of us as political commentators, if you like, we need to stop sneering at reform. We need to take them seriously and challenge them much more, because they've got money, they've got influence, they've got platform, and you could argue that without Farage they wouldn't be anywhere, but he's not going anywhere at the moment. So I think it's now time to hold them to account a lot more on what are their policies, what do they do.
And Jim, you've obviously taken a leaf out of Ed Davies' book in terms of these little things to get a bit of attention. You've got your Christmas jumper on today. So Lib Dems,
it actually looks as though it looks as though Frank and I are in black and white, and Jim's the only one in Technicolor.
Absolutely.
Well, the historian's gone all modern on us today. Jim, Joe mentioned the fact that the Lib Dems focused on those two issues of social care and the green agenda. But also, of course, they targeted their resources very effectively on Tory seats. And so I take what Joe says. It was a fabulous result for them, good recovery. They're going to have some challenges, I think, as a national party over the next few years, because, of course, the planning reforms that the new government are going to introduce will impact heavily on some of those Lib Dem seats. And my guess is that in places like Liverpool, Manchester, other areas of the north where the Lib Dems would hope their next wave of seats might come, they'll be challenged there because they're not going to be able to support building on the Greenbelt, for example. But I want to get your thoughts on Nigel Farage, because I think it's been an incredible story for reform, despite the fact that the Lib Dems won 70-odd seats, despite the fact that, as Joe's indicated, the Greens improved in terms of their number of MPs. And of course, you've got Jeremy Corbyn as Merry Men of Independence. The big story of the year has been Nigel Farage again.
Well, you're obviously influenced by the excessive number of appearances that this man has on BBC's Question Time, Frank. I mean, at the moment, I mean, if we're making an assessment of this year, then they've got a handful of MPs. I mean, the big winners this year were the Labour Party. I mean, there was a historic election victory. Obviously, that's been slightly masked by the problems they've had since. But let's just say that it has been a huge victory for the Labour Party. And if they turn things around, they have a huge cushion to get a second term from that huge election victory. As far as the Lib Dems are concerned, it's rather difficult. I think you're right. I mean, in a sense, they want to advance from 72, and their obvious way to advance is to start to win back in those northern areas that they used to, especially particularly in local government. There is a danger that they are in a bit of a cul-de-sac, that they've got these seats, but they're going to be vulnerable to any sort of conservative revival in quite a lot of them. With growing sentiment in favour of closer relations with Europe, the Lib Dems are on the moral high ground there. So we'll have to see how it goes. So the Greens, yes, they've made a breakthrough, but it's going to be interesting now. They're going to be tested because with Ed Miliband forcing through his green agenda, we're seeing how unpopular some elements of that are. And it's going to be a question for the country. I mean, we're ravaged with storms and everything, and people should be getting the message. But it's a question whether they get that message or whether they turn on those that are forcing them to have boilers and electric cars and all that sort of thing. I think Reform UK, they are the fascinating dark matter in British politics. And next year, the county council elections are going to be really interesting. So that's my assessment of it. But I think we have to be fair. It was massively Labour's year, although they've squandered some of their advantage.
Okay, so a good year for the Labour Party, of course, and for Reform, and for the Lib Dems, a disastrous year for the Conservative Party. And we spoke about Sunak's decision to go to the country earlier than many people expected. Let me just ask for your early reflections on new leader Kemi Badenoch. I want you to keep this to a minute, and I'll start with you, Joe.
Very disappointing. I was quite surprised that she won, but probably not as surprised as Mrs. Jenrick. And I would urge everybody to find that clip of Mrs. Jenrick suddenly realising she was on camera and needed to start clapping and look pleased, because everybody thought Robert Jenrick was going to win. I think Kemi Badenoch has been pretty useless. And there are already rumblings about trying to replace her. She's got no policies other than one about not having lunch, apparently. She's a mixed bag at Question Time, but she doesn't seem to be disciplined. And she just doesn't really seem to get it.
Jim?
I think she's everything that we thought. She's an interim leader. She's very unlikely to walk through the doors of number 10 in a few years' time. She's got a huge task to try and bring the party together. As Joe says, there are already rumblings. I mean, I think one thing that will keep her in her position for a year or two is that the people will think of the absolute pantomime of this continual change of Conservative leaders, and the very prospect of that could dissuade some of those that would like to make a change. But I think we need to give her a little bit more time. She's allegedly conducting some fundamental policy reviews, and we'll have to see what that comes up with. But no, she doesn't surprise me. I attended a lunch with Mel Stride the other day, the Shadow Chancellor, and remain firm in my conviction that the party would have been far better with him. He came over really well at the lunch, talking about critiquing Rachel Reeves' performances as Chancellor, and putting forward, centrist sort of conservative views. Cleverly was available, Stride was available, but they went for this risk of Kemi Badenoch, and I think we'll have her with us for 2 or 3 years, because I just don't think they'll risk the pantomime of another leadership election.
Okay, well, let's move on to another surprise election, and one that was totally unnecessary, another that totally backfired, and that, of course, was across the channel in France. And Mr. Macron, the president, decided that on the back of poor European election results, which saw the former National Front, led by Marine Le Pen, do particularly well, he'd go to the country and put his government to test and say to the French people, well, it's okay just voting in these polls that don't really affect anything. Let's see what you really think. And what the French people really thought was that Macron is a busted flush. And so you've got this situation in France that is akin to what we were experiencing in the dying embers of the Conservative government, because the Prime Minister that President Macron was eventually able to appoint, Barnier, lasted only a little longer than the lettuce and Liz Truss. So French politics may seem to people, does it really matter? But of course, it hugely matters to the global economy, to the future of Europe, to issues such as Ukraine, to Syria. This is a hugely important and significant country. And it seems to me that we've got the prospect of it falling into the sort of chaos, as I say, we sadly experienced in the UK for a number of years. I'm not sure how they get out of it. But let me just take you back, Joe, to the summer and to that remarkable decision that Macron made. Nobody saw that coming, did they?
No, and it was right in the middle of the Olympics as well. I mean, as if France hadn't got enough to deal with. However, you must say France does a jolly good event. The Olympics were amazing. The restoration and reopening of Notre Dame, also equally amazing. So, if you want events, go to France. If you want politics, don't go to France. It's interesting, isn't it? Because Emmanuel Macron, if you remember, appeared out of nowhere. He was a sort of an outlier. He was young, he was different. He wanted to have a whole new political movement, and off he went. And sure enough, that old saying about all political careers end in failure looks like it's coming to a chateau near you sometime soon. So he's now on to a new prime minister, but the government is in stalemate. And as you say, Frank, what is really worrying is the impact that it can have across the world, particularly with, and I know we'll move across the Atlantic in a minute, particularly with a new Trump term about to start in a couple of weeks, where Europe has become ever more important because of NATO, because of security, because of the things that you mentioned, Syria and Ukraine, but also things like energy. I mean, France is the biggest single supplier of energy. So if there is a hiatus in government there, and they can't get a budget through and all the rest of it, that's going to have an impact on everybody. So I think the instability in Europe, and it's not just France, it's also Germany. But of course, Marine Le Pen, the National Front leader, Front National, is waiting for the outcome of a court case in March next year, which, if it goes against her, could ban her from public office. So that might be significant, but they're for sure, they are in the mud.
And why Macron called that election more baffling than Sunak's decision, Jim, because as Joe's indicated, they had the Olympics to come, which were a huge success. Then he's had the reopening of the restored Notre Dame. And again, just to evidence what I was saying in terms of the importance of France and the power that it has, Macron, despite his domestic difficulties, was still able to secure the first meeting of Trump and Zelensky since Trump was re-elected to the presidency, was still able to pull in all the big names to that Notre Dame opening, and will still play a significant role in geopolitics. But as bad decisions go, Jim, I think that was almost the worst that we saw this year.
Well, I want to give him a bit more slack for the reasons you've just mentioned. I mean, I think David Lammy should be worried at the power of diplomacy that the French president has demonstrated in the examples that you've given. He was trying to smoke out the right. He was actually challenging the French people. Do you actually want, a right-wing president in the future? You've got to choose. I mean, just to do a
but
sort
why
of.
Didn't he wait, Jim, until after the Olympics? Because it was clear that that event was going to give the whole country a boost. And surely on the back of that, he could have gone to the country and be more confident in terms of winning some votes. Not suggesting that it would have given him ultimate victory or overall victory, but surely his party and Progressive would have performed better.
Maybe, the goodwill factor from the Olympics could be overemphasized. I just wanted to sort of compare our two countries because, in a sense, there are comparisons, there are similarities, and there are differences. I mean, first of all, there is what the result of that. I mean, in a sense, he allowed the French people to speak their minds, and the French people are divided in three ways. There is a strong left in France, which there isn't in Britain since the dismantling of Corbynism. There is a developed right in France around Marine Le Pen. There isn't in this country, although it may develop around Reform UK. And then we have this struggling centre, which is true in France with Macron. It's true in Britain with Starmer. And of course, it's true in the United States with Biden and Harris. So in a sense, it's a Western phenomenon. You've got these sort of splits.
I think the thing I'd say in terms of French politics is that watch this space, because Joe's quite right. Le Pen faces that court case in March, and then of course you're going to have an awful lot of pressure before then, I would suggest, in terms of Macron's own position, because although presidents do have fixed terms, there's no reason why the opposition parties cannot agitate to say, well, this impasse is not going to be broken unless you actually resign and give us the opportunity for a presidential election. So
there is a new prime minister now. Maybe he can fix things. I don't know.
I will see. And then of course you've got the German elections as well to look forward to in February, and that combination of French-German trials and tribulations is causing huge problems across the European Union itself. And it's amazing to think, isn't it, that sort of 10, 15 years ago, the three economic powerhouses of Europe were the UK, France and Germany. And now Italy, Spain and Greece are performing better. So listen, it's going to be a turbulent time in Europe. I'm going to stop the conversation on France and Europe, Jim, because I'm conscious of the time, and given the fact that you were the one who was complaining we were running over an hour for our podcasts, I always remind you of this when you start waffling on over issues that you shouldn't. Let's turn finally, in the first part of the podcast today, to the biggest election of the year, and that, of course, was that of Donald Trump. And I said Macron's decision was almost the worst, but worse than that, in my view, was Joe Biden's decision to hang on for as long as he did, in terms of saying he was going to put himself forward for the presidency for a second term. And that, in no small part, allowed Donald Trump to be re-elected to the States. Joe, in terms of the worst politician of the year, I think Joe Biden would be hard to argue against him winning that particular accolade, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's a real shame because, his vanity, his sense of entitlement, his stubbornness has allowed the Democrats to absolutely fail, despite the fact that Kamala Harris, she was nominated and unopposed, and within an astonishing amount of time, short space of time, raised an astonishing amount of money. There were rallies. We talked about it on the podcast of the upbeat rallies, and so very different to our own political party conferences. And I think we all thought it was going to be close. I don't think most of us thought that Donald Trump was going to absolutely romp away. And he's now got pretty much untrammeled power as he goes into office in January.
And Donald Trump, if Joe Biden was the biggest loser of the year, if I can put it that way, Donald Trump probably the biggest winner, Jim?
Well, certainly in American politics, yes. I mean, it was an absolutely phenomenal.
Well, don't you think just globally, if you think of all of the other election victories, don't you think that is the greatest comeback of all time politically?
Well, yes, it's certainly. I mean, Richard Nixon came back. I remember covering his.
He wasn't a convicted felon, though, who tried to create an
No.
insurrection.
In that sense, yes.
So
But in '62, he ran for the governorship of California.
I've got absolutely no time for Donald Trump. But if you were to look at this historically and objectively, surely you've got to say this was the greatest political comeback of all time, haven't you?
Even more than Grover Cleveland in the late 19th century. Yeah, and
Happy Christmas, listeners.
It's very interesting now because he's making all these weird appointments, and he's going to abolish turning the clocks back every autumn, which is something I'd like to see in this country as well, by the way. But there is this sort of you hear commentators saying, he's put up all this flack, and then when he actually gets into office, knowing it's his last 4 years, he might actually govern in a more moderate way. So we'll just have to see. I mean, the hyperbole is so great that any pullback from it will be greeted with acclaim. Just one little reflection. Of course, he got off all his court cases, and we've been talking about Marine Le Pen facing the court and Netanyahu facing the court in Israel. We'll see whether anyone gets convicted of these things. So there's a sort of impression that great people are immune from this, but I mean, just on Joe Biden, obviously he should have stood down, not left his party in this dilemma. But let's pay tribute to a man who's got the American infrastructure program going. There's tremendous expenditure going on in there, and I think in retrospect, history will be a little bit kinder to him. But it's a very sad end.
Sad end to what was a remarkable career in politics for Joe Biden, but then compounded by his decision to pardon his son. So I think, a very, very tragic end to what has been, as I say, a really good career. We've not even managed to talk about some of those incredible and really worrying issues that have affected the world this year, such as Ukraine, which rumbles on, of course. Then we've had the continuation of hostilities in Israel, and then the fall of the Assad regime, which Joe and I discussed at length last week. But 2024 has, as I say, been a momentous year. There's too much to fit into one final podcast, particularly when my co-guests won't take direction, James. So we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be picking out our best, our worst, our highlights, and looking at some of the lowlights as well. Stick with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the second part of the Downtown Den Politics podcast, the podcast where the chair, me, Frank McKenna, tries but fails dismally to keep in check his co-guests, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. So let me see if I can do any better in this part of the podcast, the last part of our political podcast for 2024. And we're going to be looking back on who's up, who's down, some of the highlights, some of the lowlights. And I'm going to start with the biggest loser of the year in the UK. Which politician do you think has lost badly in 2024? Start with you, please, Joe.
Robert Jenrick, as mentioned before, he was absolutely convinced he was going to win the Tory leadership, and he didn't, and he's at a bit of a loss, I think, as to what to do next. He's got a position in the shadow cabinet, but you can see that, is he waiting for a moment to pounce on Kemi, or is he going to defect to Reform, or is he just going to sit there and bide his time?
James?
I answer this in a slightly different way, and I'm going to say the biggest loser, in a sense, was Andy Street. Not casting any aspersions on him, but on the dynamics of the elected mayors in England, which I think is going to be an interesting continuing development, particularly with the announcement today of the devolution plans that the government have got. You're left with Ben Houchin, who I'll come back to when we do our other awards, but Andy, was doing a good job in the West Midlands, and the tide of Labour that was building up towards the general election in May swept him away just. So I think, in terms of, not a loser in terms of an author of his own misfortunes, but because he was carried away from politics and then didn't take a seat in Westminster, I thought he might become a presence at Westminster and, potentially do well within the Conservative Party. But he seems to have gone quiet at the moment. You may have better information, Frank, on what he's actually doing now. But, a big loss, really, to British politics, if I may answer the question in that way.
I totally agree with the analysis that Andy Street is a big loss to politics, and that is not casting aspersions at all on his replacement, Richard Parker, who's doing a fine job in the West Midlands. But Andy Street was a victim of national politics. And I think that all of us on this podcast really wish to see mayors and indeed local government leaders judged on their own performance and what they deliver, rather than having to rely on national politicians. And sadly, we do have this instinct in the UK to go to the polls at every poll, whether it be a local election, a parish council election, or a mayoral election, and vote depending on how we see the government performing. People like Andy Street, who did a fabulous job over sort of 8-year period for the West Midlands, had to fall victim of that poor national performance of the Conservative Party. So I totally agree with those comments, Jim. I don't think I can look beyond Rishi Sunak, though, in terms of loser of the year, because listen, he may have been the guy who was finally holding the bat into an inevitable defeat after the chaos that had been inflicted on the Conservative Party by, irony of ironies, Brexit, because that party, the country's not recovered, but that party is not recovered from that Brexit referendum. And Sunak, I think, was somebody who, during the pandemic, was seen as a potential prime minister, was seen as somebody who would be good at the job if he ever did enter number 10. And it actually proved to be a step way too far for him. I never felt as though he was comfortable in the job. And you can blame internal forces of the Conservative Party, you can blame the inheritance that he had. But much in the same way as Liz Truss, I felt, had been over-promoted, Theresa May never really got to grips with the job of Prime Minister, in my view. Sunak, not comfortable in the job, in my opinion, called the election at the weirdest of times. If he was going to go early, I agree with you, Joe, he should have gone in the spring. Went at the worst possible time, in my opinion, and so I'm afraid for me, it's Rishi Sunak is the loser of the year as far as UK politics is concerned. And then we move on to the international scene. I'll be very brief because I think I've already covered this in the first part of the podcast. For me, it had to be Joe Biden. What about you, Jim? Internationally, biggest loser of the year in politics.
Well, I mean, it could be Biden or Macron, but can I just throw in a sort of a thought here that Netanyahu and Putin. Netanyahu, I made it clear I believe in the right of Israel to exist, and it cannot tolerate missiles being fired into its territory. But the overreaction and what it's now doing, dismantling the Syrian army, when this new government is trying to get international recognition, is deeply irresponsible. And leaving Syria without an army is a bit like leaving Iraq without an army, and we saw what happened there. And the dreadful overreaction in Gaza, puts Netanyahu in the frame for that. And Putin, all right, we all think we're going to have to do some accommodation on Ukraine, but the fact that he's lost his status in Syria, and is an appalling man. So I just put those two in the frame as well.
No, good shouts, Jim. Joe?
Well, I was going to say Netanyahu as well, because we've already discussed Biden and Macron. And I think, Jim's absolutely right. Netanyahu has behaved abominably, and the closure of the Israeli embassy in Dublin, because Dublin is supporting the International Criminal Court's claim that Netanyahu is a war criminal. I mean, he is behaving like a despot, and he is still attacking Syria, meddling, and now talking about occupying more of the Golan Heights. And I think he is a warmonger, and I think he is one of the most dangerous people in the world.
Well, I think Netanyahu wins that one, both in terms of the case that you both made and a 2-1 against Joe Biden anyway. And I'm certainly not going to argue with either of you in terms of the comments you've made about the Israeli leader. Let's move on to more positive things then. And as I say, we are big devolutionists. We're big supporters and advocates of local government. And so it's incumbent upon us to try and give our elected mayors a profile and to recognise the great work that they do. And there are 11 across the country now. And there's going to be more following an announcement today by the Labour government of additional devolution across the country. We don't know what that white paper is going to look like in its entirety yet, but you can bet your bottom dollar there will be more elected mayors. Jim, again, I'll start with you on this one. Elected Mayor of the Year across the UK. I think I know your answer from an earlier remark you made, but tell us anyway.
Well, yes, I mean, in our what is sort of loosely called our own patch, Andy Burnham has continued to do what this whole job was meant to do and be a great champion for Greater Manchester. And Steve Rotherham is getting on with some.
Can you give us your answer, Jim, and allow us to name our people that we think have done a good job?
Yeah, my answer is Ben Houchin, the sole mayor, elected mayor of a major conurbation. He's had a rough time. He's been subject to investigations about the developments on Teesside. But I think he increasingly comes over as a constructive force in the government of our metropolitan areas, and is prepared to work with what is otherwise a complete set of Labour mayors. And I think it's going to be very interesting. As I said earlier on, I think this mayoral grouping is going to be a powerful force in British politics, and it'll be a big Labour-dominated force, leaning into a Labour government. We've heard Andy Burnham this weekend saying these devolved powers that have been announced today still don't include that devolution of skills that you, Frank, have campaigned for and Andy has. But I think Ben Houchin, but being prepared to work in a constructive manner with his Labour peers, will enhance his status. So Ben Houchin gets it from me.
Joe?
Well, up until July, Andy Street, for reasons already mentioned. And I completely agree with Jim, what he said about Ben Houchin. I heard him on the radio this morning. I mean, he is collaborative, he's sensible, he's grown up. But, Andy Burnham is an exemplar of what a mayor can do. And, if you compare Andy Burnham with Sadiq Khan, both from the same political party, the effect and the voice that Andy Burnham has, that he uses for the people he represents, is a gazillion times louder than the one you ever hear from Sadiq Khan. So Andy Burnham gets my vote.
Okay, interesting choices. The Ben Houchin shout is a good one, Jim, I have to say. The only Tory left standing and so obviously was able to overcome those challenges that we spoke of earlier, of people going out and just voting on the national issues. He's clearly got himself a big old following up there in Teesside, and a personality that has carried him over the line. And Sandy Street was well known in the West Midlands, but obviously Houchin did an even better job in that respect. And I do wonder whether, if the Conservative Party can get its act together over the next few years, Ben Houchin may become a national figure, because he's certainly got that in him. Of course, you might think he's got more power where he is, but he's prime ministerial material. I think he's a very, very impressive character. But for me, I'm going to come very, very close to home, and I'm going to give the Mayor of the Year title to Steve Rotherham from Liverpool City region, because I think that Steve is the epitome of what a really good mayor should look like. Take the points that you make about Houchin and Burnham, but both of them from time to time can get a little carried away in terms of the politics. Steve, on the other hand, goes about his business quietly. He's Liverpool and Liverpool City region rather than Labour mayor, and I think that makes a big difference when it comes to negotiating with the government. I know for a fact that in Whitehall he is very, very well regarded. They know that when they have a conversation with Steve, he can be trusted, he can deliver. And I would remind people, particularly those perhaps who don't follow Liverpool politics as much as I sadly have to, of the chaos and carnage across Merseyside that there once was, in terms of the 6 boroughs, the 5 boroughs and Liverpool City Council, often fighting like cats in a sack whenever it came to any issue. And it lost this city region literally millions and millions of pounds in investment, both in terms of it not looking serious to outside investors, but also in terms of losing the opportunity of building a tram because they couldn't agree on what route to take. If you look at where Liverpool City region is now, under the leadership of Steve Rotherham, with those 5 boroughs and the city operating as one, his inheritance was nowhere near what Andy Burnham, for example, in Greater Manchester got. And I think Steve has done a fabulous job, will continue to do a good job. And of course, his plans for the future in terms of utilising the resource of the Freeport and those natural assets that Liverpool has in terms of the Mersey and some of the great things he can do on the green agenda, then it's Steve Rotherham for me. Right, let's move on to our next one then. And I think we're going to stay with the positive, and we're going to say one to watch, up-and-coming MP. Joe?
Well, I would go for Ellie Chown. She is the new Green MP for North Hertfordshire. Been a local councillor, was an MEP, overturned a 20,000 Tory majority. She's an example of somebody who's worked the patch. And we already spoke before about, in a way, it's not surprising that Reform did quite so well. It's a lot harder for the Greens. And I think for her to do this, and I, on election night, was watching that particular count, and the defeated Tory Bill Wiggins, who'd been there for ever and ever, was incredibly magnanimous in his defeat. And I think she's going to be one to watch. And I would just say that Emily Thornberry, she's not new. She's been around for ages. She's a bit Marmite, but I think she's going to be absolutely fantastic in her new role as chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. And I think those select committee chairs and the select committee system is where we see politicians and politics at its very best. Jim?
I've struggled with this, to be honest. I think it's a little bit early. There's so many of them that they're all sort of fighting for recognition, and so I've really struggled with it. I mean, in the northwest, I'm keeping an eye on the Liberal Democrat MP for Cheadle, who's now a front bencher, who I think is doing very well, but his name escapes me. She's doing very well. Paul War in Rochdale, I think.
She needs to improve on name recognition then, doesn't she?
Can you help me, Joe, who I'm talking about?
Not without looking it up, but I'll do it while you're talking. And yes,
bless
Paul
you.
War,
And
fantastic.
Paul War in Rochdale, I think, has got potential. And for the Conservatives, Andrew Snowden in Fylde, though he's a whip, so we've not heard so much from him. But I'm sorry, I've thought about this, but at the moment, it's very difficult for any of them to sort of punch through. But that's my answer on that.
Do you mean Tom Morrison?
No, the other one. He's Hazel Grove.
We'll let these two people argue about who they're going to Google next to find out the name of the person they think is one to watch, and they can't even fucking remember
Lisa
the name.
Smart.
Lisa Smart. Lisa Smart.
Oh, how did you forget that name? Right, let me move on, James, and give you my answer to this particular question, which I thought would be a quick one, actually. So for me, Kim Leadbeater, because she's introduced probably the most significant piece of legislation we have seen in a long, long time in terms of the assisted dying bill. And whatever your thoughts and views on that particular issue, and we do disagree agreeably in terms of that matter, the fact that she was able to take that through the Parliament in the way that she did, I think was very, very impressive, and did, as we said at the time, the House of Commons an awful lot of good during a period when Parliament, let's face it, has not covered itself in glory. So for me, Kim gets that award of Backbencher of the Year, one to watch. I think she may at some point be given a job in government. But I have to say, Joe, a great call in terms of Emily Thornberry. And I do think she's got a really significant job now in terms of that chair of the Foreign Select Committee. I wonder whether she wakes up at times and thinks maybe it was a blessing in disguise not to be sent off to do whatever minor role in the cabinet she'd have been given. But I do think, when it comes to communication, it's the likes of Emily Thornberry that Starmer's team actually miss. Because, okay, she can drop a bollock from time to time, but she is one of Labour's better performers in terms of the media, in my opinion. So Jim's sort of not convinced by that.
I think she comes over as entitled, North London, everything Labour needs to move away from. But we're allowed to differ on this podcast.
We are. It's interesting because, of course, Emily was born and brought up on a council estate. So there you go. Just proves that, women who get themselves educated and up the political ladder can be seen as sniffy and middle class, when Eton boys are told that how fucking fantastic you are to be able to go on to Question Time 38 times, and we can all celebrate the fact. Well, there you go. It just shows that sexism is alive and well in the UK, doesn't it, James?
Yeah. You're just the token men on this podcast.
Listen, we know the big voice on this podcast is Joe, and it's neither Jim or I. Right, let's move on then, and let's go for your political moments of the year. Joe.
Assad, the fall of Assad in Syria, completely unexpected, completely out of the blue, and it has thrown a real spanner in the non-working parts of the Middle East. It's isolated Putin and Iran. It's put different pressure on Israel for other reasons. It's put pressure on Europe as to how we engage with the new regime, and America, whether or not Trump he said, oh, we're not getting involved in this. Well, they're going to have to at some point, and Antony Blinken's there at the moment. I think the ramifications of that will be massive, and I think it's still too early to say. One hopes that it's going to be good for the people of Syria, because there's an awful lot of hope and belief and freedom. And one hopes it's not going to turn into Afghanistan. But that, for me, is the shock political event of the year.
Jim?
Right at the beginning of the year, really, the Mr. Bates versus the Post Office and the political ramifications from that. The politicians, weren't up to speed on it, but the fact that those programs were watched and made a difference, and then it led on later in the year. We had the blood scandal compensation, and then the fall of the Archbishop of Canterbury. I'm sort of making a theme here that when people despair that anything can be done and they always get away with it, This year, if there's a glimmer of hope in a pretty grim year, I think it started off with that programme right at the beginning of the year and its consequences, and victims of blood scandals, post office, child abuse in the Church of England, can feel. I mean, the actual compensation things are taking time, and we've got to keep an eye on it. But that would be my sort of political moment of the year, or many moments of the year.
For me, I'm going to be very personal about this, and it was 4th of July, and we hosted our City of Liverpool Business Awards on that evening. So obviously coincidental, but a great night, because we were able to beam live into the Sefton Powerhouse. It's around 10 o'clock, the exit poll. And of course, it was announced that Keir Starmer had secured first Labour victory in 14 years, this absolute landslide. But the reason that that moment sticks with me wasn't the result, wasn't the joy that on a personal level I felt, being somebody who's been active in the Labour Party for many years now, but the spontaneous round of applause from the 250 business leaders in the room, not all of whom, I have to tell you, are Labour supporters or natural Labour voters. But the relief, the sense of the fact that the government that we had, Conservative, and I think it's quickly forgotten these days, how bad that government was. And you got business people, entrepreneurs in that room, many I know, who have always voted Tory, just round of applause when that exit poll dropped. And that for me was the moment of the year. Not to mention the fact that it was a great awards evening, and what a stunning venue to celebrate an election victory in, the Sefton Powerhouse. I tell you this from experience, although I loved it dearly, a much better setting than Skelmersdale Labour Club, which is where I celebrated previous Labour victories in the past. So there you go. That was my political moment of the year. Right, last one, guys. We've got two to name. I'm going to ask, first of all, for your international politician of the year, and I'll start with you this time, Jim.
Zelensky, I think, his courage at continuing to battle away, when things are beginning to undermine him. The man's courage is immense. It's going to be a very difficult year to come. I'd also like to mention Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, who's sort of emerged. We've talked about the crumbling of Germany and France, and she's sort of emerged from a sort of right-wing, a sort of extremist sort of position to actually being quite a significant figure in Europe. So those would be my two international ones.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Joe?
Zelensky, for the same reason. I mean, the fact that he just keeps going, and he keeps, turning up, speaking to people, and he never expected to be doing this. I think it's astonishing.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to go for Donald Trump, because, as I mentioned in the first part of the programme, I don't think anybody would have given him a cat in hell's chance of securing a second term after the insurrection on the 6th of January and what followed. And we can all hold our head in our hands and say, well, if the Democrats would have done this, or if the Republican Party would have done that. But the fact remains that the guy stuck to his guns, stuck to his agenda, actually turned what most politicians would have seen as disaster into advantage. So all of those court cases just gave him wind in his sails to take him through to a remarkable victory to become president for a second time. So it's Donald Trump for me, and I don't say that with a great deal of pleasure, but I think it's difficult to suggest that, again, as I mentioned in the first part of the podcast, that is not the greatest political comeback, certainly in modern history. So if the orange one's listening, Nigel Farage isn't the only one you should consider giving a job to.
Excuse me.
In terms of Brits. Come on, Don. It makes sense. Right. Final one then. Politician of the year in the UK. And I'll start with you, Joe.
Kim Leadbeater, for the reasons that you said earlier. She behaved with such dignity and such grace in doing something so difficult and so emotive. And I think what's really important, I heard her dad being interviewed the other day, and he said, she's now going to be known for herself, not just being Joe's sister.
Yeah, that's a lovely point, actually. Yeah. Jim?
I'm going to go for Wes Streeting. The new Labour government are struggling to connect with the electorate, and Wes is doing that. Some mischievous comments towards the very end of the year, because Wes said that not giving Cameron the permission to bomb Syria could have saved years of problems, and Ed Miliband kicking back, and then everyone's taken off with this Wes Streeting's on manoeuvres. I think it's a little early for that, but I think Wes has established himself as the credible alternative to Keir Starmer this year. Obviously, a lot will depend on his delivery on health. If he fails to deliver, then all the charisma that we at Downtown know about Wes will count for nothing. But I'm giving it him rather than Keir Starmer, who's obviously a contender for it because of his great election victory. But Wes Streeting for me.
Yes, well, I'm going to give it to Keir Starmer because, of course, we do forget quickly in politics, don't we? And of course, when we talk about poor inheritance, both in terms of what the government bestowed, Conservative government bestowed on Labour, but we forget what Keir Starmer inherited from Jeremy Corbyn, an absolutely shattered Labour Party in total turmoil and chaos. And Starmer, to his great credit, took it on, and he took the job on in a very steady Eddie way. And a year into his time as leader of the opposition, he lost a Hartlepool by-election, first time Labour had ever lost that constituency, and people were talking about ditching him, and people in the running mentioned Wes Streeting, Angela Rayner, Rachel Reeves. But of course, 3 years later, Keir Starmer had turned the ship around and delivered Labour's first victory in 14 years. So for me, Keir Starmer is Politician of the Year. And just one cautionary note to the Labour Party and Labour MPs. One of, not the only, but one of the reasons that the Conservative Party were dumped on their arses in the way that they were was because people felt as though the Conservative Party had decided that the Conservative Party was more important than the country. And even in its early days, I'm starting to be a little concerned that some Labour MPs are beginning to think that what is happening internally is perhaps more important than what they're delivering externally. And if Labour decided to ditch Starmer before the next election, then I think the electorate would look very, very dimly on that decision. We promised that Labour would deliver calm, and if nothing else over the last 6 months, I still believe that it feels as though the grown-ups have taken over government once again. So for me, Keir Starmer is Politician of the Year. Right, last but certainly not least, gone but not forgotten. Of course, every year we sadly lose people, and this year has been no exception. Joe, I know that you've got a couple of people you wanted to mention as far as this was concerned.
Yes, well, John Prescott most recently, not entirely unexpected, but, somebody who's always been there, and we've paid tribute to him on this podcast, as did other people around the world and around the country. Alex Salmond, former leader of Scotland, First Minister, really shocking sudden death while he was abroad. And of course, in February this year, Alexei Navalny died in a Russian prison camp.
Jim?
Yes, I really just would fill out on John Prescott, who I knew and reported on, an architect of Labour's attempt at devolution in the early part of this century, a regional solution which didn't commend itself, but he nevertheless introduced the idea of trying to bring government closer to people. So a sad loss, and I certainly associate my thoughts about Navalny as well. I've just been listening to his memoirs. Extraordinary courage to go back to Russia in those circumstances. Don't know why he did it. Went back to his death.
Well, for me, it won't surprise you guys. It's Sir Howard Bernstein, who, of course, was a huge influence on Downtown in business, but more importantly, Manchester and the wider UK, as we learnt at his recent memorial service. George Osborne was saying that government ministers often would consult with Howard when it came to matters of regeneration and economic growth. A man who certainly would not be able to be put into the category of someone who would be comfortable in the tepid bath of managed decline. So Howard was a civil servant, but a politician to his fingertips, and was able to deliver 30 years of growth for Manchester. And that momentum that he started, alongside others, of course, will continue for many, many years to come. So Howard, I will miss him every day, and certainly will never, ever be forgotten. Certainly not in that great city that he loved of Manchester. So that brings us to the close of our final Downtown Den Politics podcast of 2024. But fear not, if you wish to continue to listen to our podcasts, then we will have a couple of replays from the past year that you can catch up with over Christmas. If you go onto your Spotify account, you can do that. And we have a live interview with Steve Rotherham, which we recorded two or 3 weeks ago now. An hour Q&A between Steve and I in front of a live Liverpool audience, where the Mayor of the Year, I am pulling rank as far as that particular position is concerned, the Mayor of the Year, Steve Rotherham, outlined his thoughts, his plans for the future of the Liverpool City region, but also reflected on the Labour government and other matters too. So if you want to get your fix of the Downtown Den Politics podcast, then please listen to that interview with Steve and some of the replays that we are going to have running through the Christmas period. Happy Christmas, everyone. Wishing you a good and peaceful new year too, and a successful one. We'll see you on the other side, when Jim will be giving us more thoughts on what happened in 1873, and Joe Phillips will continue to be the boss of the Downtown Den Politics podcast. Happy 2024 Christmas, and all the very best for 2025. We'll see you on the other side.